Hi, I'm Ian Miller. I work with the University of Salford in the Archaeology department because by profession that's what I do. I am an archaeologist. But I do have a particular interest in the textile industry and particularly its remains and the built environment that the textile industry has left. And living in Lancashire, that is how I see it as our greatest resource. So for me, it's quite an honour today to come into Halton Mill because I've never been here before. And Halton Mill represents to me what has been the evolution of the textile industry in this part of Lancashire. Now, I think many people might think of textile mill as your classic, massive, big urban mill with hundreds of thousands of spindles turning out miles of yarn on a daily basis, which kind of was the case by the end of the 20th century, or the start of the 20th century rather, but there wasn't a process that got there. So what I was going to do today, if you will bear with me, is perhaps run through the textile industry from its very earliest days and how we got to be what I call the manufacturing workshop of the world in terms of cotton. So I suppose a reasonable place to start might be, what do we mean by textile? It sounds obvious, but I think there is a bit of a definition here to be made. Yarn and thread. Those are basically the strands that we use. And those strands can be woven up, or indeed they can be knitted or crocheted, whatever you want to do with them, but knit them together to create the textile cloth. And there's various stages in getting to that textile cloth. And these are all important, and they all create different kind of mini trades within the wider textile industry, if you like. So where do we get textile from? What are the raw materials? You can break it down, I suppose, into four main elements, if you like. There's the natural materials, plants. Flax, not an immediately obvious one, but that was of key importance to the area from the 15th century onward. Cotton, that is probably the one everybody knows the best, certainly in terms of the Lancashire textile industry. Other ones you might not think of so much are jute, and really we didn't see too much of that in Lancashire, although it was very important in a place like Barrow-in-Furness, with the main centre actually being in Dundee. That became known as Jutopolis by the end of the 19th century. And the other one that was used a lot, but again, don't really think of as a textile, is hemp. Animals, the obvious one, sheep for wool. We do get wool from other animals. You can get Angora from rabbits, for instance. And whether it's an animal or not is debatable, but I would certainly classify it as an animal. It's the silkworm. And this again was a very important textile that had an important impact on the area around Halton. As we get into the 20th century, we saw the introduction of a lot of artificial fibres. Your rayons, your nylons, your polyesters, your acrylics that were so popular in the 1960s and 1970s, and actually saw the death of a lot of the traditional textile mills. So we're not going to talk about those. And then ones that, again, just really for completeness, are some quite obscure ones, but I'll call minerals, which would include asbestos. Believe it or not, you can spin and weave asbestos, as you would for fire retardant suits, and glass fibre. Again, these are actually used essentially for textiles. So we think of textiles, or it's easy to think of textiles as this big 19th century industry, which it undoubtedly was. But let's make no mistake, textiles have been around since the dawn of man, and we have archaeological evidence certainly for flax cultivation in the Near East, 8000 BC. And whilst we can't be 100% certain, but it is hugely likely that flax was being cultivated to create textiles. There's better evidence from 6000 BC for woven fabrics. None of this is in Britain, I hasten to add, but it is in the wider world. A place like Egypt, where we know linen cloth was being produced as long ago as 5000 BC. If we spin forward through to the medieval period, the post-Norman conquest, the 13th, 14th century in England, by that date, woolen cloth had become one of the most important commodities in Britain. It was our largest export. It's what the country's GDP depended on, was the export of woolen cloth. We were great in Britain in that, in terms of the woolen industry, not because we were brilliant weavers, but because the climate was extremely good for the cultivation of the right type of sheep. Sheep is the main source of wool, and as I mentioned, we can get this from other animals as well. Cashmere and mohair from goats, Angora from rabbits, but of course sheep are the main source of wool. Wool is distinguished from other types of animal hair. It's very special in some respects, in that the individual strands are coated with a kind of a grease and a type of scales, and they're very tightly crimped, which does give it very, very special properties and makes it really good, A, to work with, and B, to use as garments once you've actually woven up the goods. A type of wool, or a type of woolen product, were known as worsteds, and these were really the fine woolen garments that really came to the fore in the 16th, 17th and 18th century. So we've got a picture here of a fairly spectacular lady's riding jacket that's made entirely of worsted wool. Very fine garments. For more run-of-the-mill everyday wear, you would use normal wool for your jumpers and your sweaters, etc. And basic garments. Wool's very suitable for that. So the early woolen industry was essentially of supreme importance, is the only way I can put it, to the national economy. It was prevalent throughout Britain. Wherever you could raise sheep, you generally had a woolen industry. And some really nice engravings we get. Some of these date from the 13th and 14th century, certainly the bottom two are copies from engravings of that date, which show the process of producing woolen yarn. In the top, we just got the sheep shearing going on, collecting the raw fleeces, the raw material, which then has to be carded, all the strands of fibre combed in the same direction and get it ready for spinning, which you see in the bottom right hand picture. Hugely stylised. That makes it look like some very, very affluent party going on. Let's have a spinning party. Whereas the reality was that most people would actually be engaged in some sort of textile production, spinning and weaving in a domestic setting. Very frequently this was done as an ancillary occupation that they did of an evening. In addition to agriculture was the main industry at that time. But in those days, I'll probably come on to this later, but one of the great things that the industrialisation of Britain brought, and particularly the textile industry, was the advent of the clock, and time became crucial. They didn't have it in those days. The only clock they really needed was the sun. When the sun is up, we work outside. When the sun goes down, we need to find something else to do. And textile production was a great way of actually filling those hours, particularly in the winter months when it's dark, create an extra income and contribute to the national economy. Just as the 19th century and the 18th century and the 19th century, we also had this division of labour, and I think that was very much the case in the medieval period, even in a domestic setting, in producing woolen garments, in that the carding, the initial preparation of the wool, the carding and the combing and the spinning tended to be undertaken by women or even children, whereas the weaving was very much the domain of the man. In some respects, this does reflect the physical energy that was required to actually weave the cloth. So here we have three depictions of, taken from medieval manuscripts, of the machinery, the equipment that was used for weaving, the loom. On the left, that's probably from about the 13th century, which shows the typical loom of that period. And the characteristic feature of it is that it was vertical, and the weaver is kind of sitting down and weaving in between all the vertical strands there. Towards the end of the 15th century, the horizontal loom had been introduced, and this became the standard loom for the industry. And en route, there was a bit of a cross between the two, which was neither horizontal nor a vertical loom. But we can see the progression there into, by the 15th century, the type of loom that really became very popular and served the industry well up into the 19th century. Another engraving, or painting, that I couldn't resist using because it's absolutely fabulous is this painting by Forgebank Brown. It was commissioned, Forgebank Brown was commissioned to produce a series of paintings to put into Manchester Town Hall when it first opened in the 1870s. And he was commissioned to produce a series of murals that really represented the key events in the development of Manchester and indeed Lancashire as a wider county. And one in the series was the celebrated arrival of Flemish weavers into Britain in the 14th century. Now, the Flemish weavers were greatly welcomed because with them they brought not only their great skills of weaving, but they also brought their newfangled looms, which were somewhat better than the ones that we were using in Britain at that time. This painting actually shows Queen Philippa, who was the wife of Edward III, doing one of her annual, purportedly doing one of her annual visits to check that all the Flemish weavers were happy and settled in Manchester, where they had established a colony. And we can see her here on horseback, being greeted by the weavers, very keen to show her their latest products fresh off the loom. But the implication really of this painting is that the arrival of these immigrants from, they were escaping persecution from continental Europe was very much welcomed here, and it was a great benefit to the progression of the textile industry. I mentioned previously when we mentioned the types of raw materials, flax, and I think flax doesn't get the press it deserves. It was a really, really important material for textiles because it's the basic raw ingredient for the linen industry. And linen was very much an important type of textile in Lancashire from the 15th century onwards. But its origins go back an awful lot longer than that. The linen in Lancashire was dependent to some extent on Ireland, not only for the raw materials, but Ireland itself had a thriving textile industry. Now, the English government at the time saw the Irish improving and increasing the scale of their woolen industry, which we saw in England as a bit of a threat to the home-based trade. So the Irish were actively encouraged to expand their linen industry and try and distract the emphasis from woolens. So what do we use linen for? Well, a whole range of products. Towels, bed linen, tablecloths, aprons, bags. But at the end of the day, it can be a very fine fabric. And we certainly think of our finest bedclothes as being the finest linen. It's a terminology that's become embedded in some degree in the English language. A point that I put down at the bottom, which, going off that tangent a little bit, but I do find quite interesting, is that I mentioned before, the artificial fibres that came in the 60s and the 70s, much to the detriment of traditional fibres. We're actually seeing a little bit of a reversal in the 21st century, and linen is actually making a bit of a glorious comeback. And certainly by the 1990s, we see the amount of linen, or the percentages of linen that we're using for fashion garments actually increasing dramatically, which is encouraging. I just want to touch on how you produce linen because it's very different to the process for producing cotton. So much of this will have been done either in Ireland or in the other main source of flax, which were the Baltic states. And this became increasingly important in the 18th century, certainly in terms of the supply of flax to the region around Lancaster. So flax are basically big, long, stemmy plants, and it is the stem that is needed to produce the fibres that were needed. Now these are embedded in the woody stalks, which in the first instance have to be soaked in these big pits, and this process was known as retting. As an archaeologist, this is something we come across quite a lot on, for instance, Roman sites. We might find a large big pit and we've no idea what it is. But reluctant to go away from a site saying, don't know, we'll say, ooh, wow, we think we've got a retting pit. Yes, so they must have been producing textiles because it will leave virtually no evidence. So entirely plausible. But by the same vein, I suppose, it is entirely plausible because flax will have been one of the main types of textile cloth that was used, for instance, in the Roman period. Once the woody portion from the stalks has actually been removed through soaking, if you actually crush those stalks, you can pull out the fibres, which can then be combed very neatly to remove some of the shorter pieces that you don't need. This is known as tow, and this is generally set on one side and either discarded, or in the 19th century it was used and spun into lesser quality goods. The key thing I wanted to draw out with this is that certainly up to the late 18th century, all this was very much a manual process, as it was with the woolen industry. Everything we're seeing depends on manual dexterity, and when we come to the spinning and the weaving, professional craftsmanship, skill, but there's very little mechanical pieces of equipment involved. Really, the only equipment that was, or mechanical equipment that was applied to the textile industry was the fulling mill. Now we tend to associate this with the woolen trade, and these have been around for a long time. There are fulling mills documented in the Domesday Survey of 1086, 1087. So we do know they were around in the 11th century, certainly in the sort of southwest of England. Now, to some degree, the fulling mill sort of revolutionised the textile industry at that time, because fulling mills were water powered. They were driven by a water wheel, and therefore they needed a source of running water. Now, where we find these the most are in rural areas, rural valleys, often quite remote valleys, and these prove to be ideal locations for fulling mills. So consequently, the textile industry at that time did see a bit of a relocation from urban areas out towards where the fulling mills were in rural countryside localities. We know very little about just how many fulling mills there were about during the medieval times, but given the importance of the industry, I think there can be little doubt that there was a lot more than we give credit to. There's certainly some evidence to suggest that there was a fulling mill very close to Halton in Caton, and it's been suggested that the site of Willow Mill occupies the site of a medieval fulling mill. That's never been tested archaeologically, but there's no reason to actually doubt it. So aside from the fulling mills, the textile industries, wherever you were making your textiles from, was very much what we call a cottage-based industry. The textile workers plied their craft at home. As I mentioned before, the women will often have spun the yarn, occasionally helped by children, and the men typically wove. By the 16th century, possibly even earlier, but certainly by the 16th century, we had a system that was known as the putting out system, whereby a merchant would take control of the raw fibres. They would bring them to the spinners and the weavers, and they would come back and collect the finished good and take that through to market, or produce the goods and get them sold on elsewhere. Just diverting a little second to what the environment might have been like in the early 18th century in Lancashire. What we do know is we've got fulling mills, we've got people doing their craft-based industries in various localities around the area, but what was the landscape actually like? And for this, something I like to turn to myself is some of the travel writers who really came to the fore during this period. There's several of them, but one I want to quote here, or have up here, was Daniel Defoe, born in London and very much a Londoner. He did extensive travels around the country, and he came to Lancashire. He was certainly impressed with some Lancashire towns. He was particularly complimentary about Liverpool, which he thought was spectacular. He was relatively complimentary about Preston, but he did note that whilst the town is full of attorneys, proctors and notaries, there's no manufacture. And then he goes further north and he comes to Lancaster, which he said quite correctly, it's ancient. But it lies in its own ruins and there's little to recommend it apart from a decayed castle. There is no trade and few people. Bit disparaging, Daniel. But the point that is interesting here is that there was no industry and no trade and no port. As he moved further north, up towards Cumbria, he was even ruder. Who invited this Londoner? The bit I particularly like was there were no rich pleasant valleys, no lead mines and veins of rich ore, no coal pits, but all barren and wild and of no use or advantage either to man or beast. Well, that's very interesting because within 100 years, this wild, barren, useless area had actually become the manufacturing centre of the planet. And that transition, to me, is probably one of the most remarkable stages in human existence, certainly in this country, and I find it really fascinating. And off on a tangent a little bit again, I said I was an archaeologist, and that's true, but people look at me really strangely when I answer the stock question, which is usually, what's the best thing you've ever found? To which I might say, a water wheel pit from an 18th century textile mill. They think I'm joking, but I'm not, because to me, that is really exciting and it personifies exactly what Defoe missed or was too early to see. And that is this really important evolution into, as I say, the manufacturing workshop of the world. So, I talk about factories. Well, when did they come on? To answer that question, we have to look to the silk industry. And again, I think this is perhaps something that might come as a little bit of a surprise to some people. We often think of cotton having driven the transition into factory life, which in some respects was true. But the first factories were actually some time before that. The very first, probably the first in the world, first water-powered textile mill in the world, was almost certainly in Derby. And that was built by John Long as a silk throwing mill. Now, it was built very shortly after John Long did a trip to Piedmont in Italy, which was at that time probably one of the great centres of the fine silk cloth trade. And effectively, Long went over as an industrial spy, which again is one of the things I really love about this period, the amount of industrial spies who travel in Europe, bringing back all these secrets of manufacture. And Long did this very successfully because he saw this very impressive silk throwing machinery over in Italy. He came back and he set up this mill, which was worked successfully in 1721. It took him 3 years to build. In 1721, it went into production. There's actually two mills in that building. We can see Long's multi-storey one with the big arches underneath where the water wheel was, but there was a smaller building on its right-hand side. In truth, that was actually an earlier mill that was built in 1704 by a gentleman named by the name of Thomas Crotchet, but that was unsuccessful and never got to work, so generally we just kind of discount it and go straight to Long's mill. Silk factories took off relatively quickly, and certainly by the mid-18th century there are a number of silk mills across England, with particularly important centres in East Cheshire, centred on Macclesfield, Congleton, around Stockport. Of those, I think probably the old mill in Congleton, which was built in 1753, was one of the most notable, shown here, for its sheer size and scale, if nothing else. This was also important in terms of historical sources, in that it involved the very famous James Brindley in its construction. Now, James Brindley did start off life as a millwright. I think that's an important point to pick up on. No one had attempted building a structure of this kind before these mills were needed. Nobody had tried to put machinery into a building of that size and power it. There were no blueprints, there was nothing to copy, all they could go off was a corn mill, which has some very vague resemblance in that it will be powered by a water wheel and it turns things, but this was a demand on a totally different scale, and I find it fascinating how they managed to achieve this. It must have been through a lot of experimentation, must have been a few failures, but there were some undoubted successes. It's also important to note that given that we're in North Lancashire, this area was also became quite an important area for the silk industry, and we do have some mills that were at least used for producing silk, if only for a short period, around Halton and Caton, and we'll touch on those shortly. So, a quick look at how a mill might have actually worked. This will have been the problem that was faced by these engineers who had to build these things in the 1750s. The main driving force was the water wheel, which in this case was central to the mill. And as you can see, it's driving a main drive shaft, which will have been a large timber beam, effectively, connected to a series of, again, timber gear wheels, which will have powered vertical shafts going up right through the height of the mill, which in turn will have turned the machinery in the mill. Now, this system, although a little bit crude with all its wooden components, which will have weighed an absolute ton and creaked and groaned as they moved around, did form the basis for most of the textile mills in the 19th century, albeit greatly refined. So I mentioned there was silk mills in this area. The main one, we think, was Forgebank Mill, right here in Halton. Now, according to James Price, who's certainly done his research, this was established in 1744 by a gentleman by the name of William Bradshaw. Being brutally honest, we are not certain whether this was for silk or for flax, but given the progress of the silk industry at this time, there is a good chance it probably was for silk. As all mills in that period were, it was water powered, drawing its supply of water off the River Loon from Bankwear, which is still there today, unlike the mill. So I say it was probably silk. I can't dismiss flax, because flax, as I keep going on about, was an important textile. And linen mills did begin to appear in the northwest at precisely this period, in the 1740s. The earliest known linen or flax factory that's documented in the northwest was at Lowther in Westmoreland, which was first built in 1742. Now, we say mill in that, yes, it was a building that housed some machinery, but it wasn't a true mill as we might think of it today, i.e. it wasn't a full production factory. It just housed some of the machinery that did some of the processes. In this instance, it did the flax dressing, prepared the raw material, that was then passed out to spinners and weavers who were still working in a domestic setting. The fibres were passed out together with a spinning wheel that was passed out on rent, effectively, to produce the yarn. I think it would be very rude at this stage not to mention the flax mills in Kirkham that were established in 1754 by Langton, Burley and Co, because these became very important mills through the 18th and 19th centuries, and indeed became one of the largest flax mills in the country, not least as they served a burgeoning sailcloth industry in the late 18th, early 19th century, which again we'll come to. So again, really just looking at Defoe's observations of our area, and it's easy to criticise him, but one of the things that did change subsequent to his visit and I think probably one of the key factors in the industrialisation of this area was the Port of Lancaster, which was given parliamentary consent in 1750. This enabled a brand new port to be built at Lancaster, and this not only allowed trade from all over the country to actually enter Lancaster, it gave particular favourable trading advantage with the Baltic states, the West Indies, and to some degree also with Ireland, which, as you can imagine, was a great boost for the flax/linen industry. Cotton is probably one of the key fabrics, the key raw material for textiles in Lancashire. It did become dominant in the 19th century. It's been around for a while in this country. The earliest known reference we have to it is in 1601, where it's specifically mentioned in the will of a weaver in Bolton. And the fact that it's mentioned in his will is quite telling. It was obviously a precious commodity, a valuable commodity that would be passed on to his heirs. It was still used to some degree, was cotton, but very sparingly, in a fabric called fustian that was a combination of linen and cotton, but a very fine fabric, a very nice fabric. But by the 18th century, the middle classes were beginning to look for a new type of fabric, a fabric which would meet all their demands for durability, for comfort, for cheapness, for washing, and cotton fitted that bill. Now, this was quite handy because at this time the British Empire was expanding dramatically. The East India Company was become all-powerful with its trading links, particularly with India. And it is in India that they found this cheap cotton fabric that was known as calico. And this was brought back to Britain in great quantity, where it found this mass market. It was immensely popular, too popular. Again, the government of the day was getting very concerned about this, very anxious to protect the still all-important woolen industry, and they introduced a load of, an act called the Calico Act in 1721, which prohibited the wearing of calicos, effectively banned its use, which is a very draconian measure, but that was the extent to which there was fears for the woolen industry. This prohibition didn't last too long, and the ban was lifted in the 1740s, which really signalled the onset of cotton as a fairly major industry in Britain. By the 1750s, cotton cloth was being produced and imports were flying in from West India. The amount of imports through the Port of Lancaster, not least, began to grow and grow. And then by the 1790s, we started to import raw cotton from the American plantations. And of course, this is linked to the dark side of the industry that, until recently, has never really been the unspoken side, which of course was the slavery aspect of it. I think at the bottom, I'm just pushing the point, but by the middle of the 19th century, I think really it is fascinating to push this, that by the middle of the 19th century, Britain was producing half of the world's cotton cloth, even though not a scrap of that raw material was produced in this country. And that does say a lot, good or bad. So flax and silk, they have moved into factories, semi-factories, by the 1750s. They'd made that transition. Cotton and wool hadn't. Cotton and wool was still being produced on the domestic scale. But things were set to change, they had to change. So traditionally, we would have one handling weaver, would be weaving up the yarn that's produced by 4 spinsters. That was the basic ratio. This changed in 1733 with the introduction of the first of the really important mechanical devices that were introduced in the 18th century, that really enabled industrialisation. And that was the flying shuttle that was introduced by a bloke called John Kay of Bury. Now, the traditional shuttle had to be passed backward and forward through the weft by hand. It was a dexterous job, but it was also very, very, very slow. Kay's shuttle was shot out of a box mechanically and fired backward and forward, carrying the weft without the weaver coming into contact at all with the shuttle, and speeded up things dramatically. The net result of this is that there became a pressing demand to mechanise the spinning process, because weavers were outstripping their supply of yarn tenfold. That was met in 1764 by a guy called James Hargreaves, who introduced a machine called the spinning jenny. And what this did was effectively spin yarn on 20 or 30 spindles at one time. So it was evidently doing the work of several spinsters. This was a major step forward in the production of yarn that could supply the increased output that the flying shuttle had done for weaving. And it's estimated by the late 1770s there were about 20,000 spinning jennies were in use, most of which were applied to the cotton industry. It was applied to the spinning of wool, but wool was a little bit more difficult, A, because of its nature, and B, because it was actually controlled by a lot of ancient practices that did restrict, in some respects, its mechanisation. And the mechanisation of wool always lagged behind the mechanisation, the factorisation of wool. And cotton always had this slight advantage as it really spearheaded the British industry into the factory system. Looking very quickly at weavers' cottages, this is something that we do have in our landscape. They do survive, not so much in North Lancashire, but certainly in Central Lancashire and South East Lancashire. We do get this characteristic building that I think makes quite an important contribution to a lot of our townscapes and even rural landscapes. Very usually three-storey. The defining characteristic is the upper floor, or in some cases the upper two floors, of this continuous row of windows, which very clearly shows those to have been what we would call loom shops, which will have been fitted with the loom. The number of windows being required to bring enough light in for the weavers to see what they're doing. We call them loom shops, but I think it's fair to say that some will also have been jenny shops, because we will also have seen the spinning jennies being used in that sort of environment. I don't know the date of this photograph. I suspect it's probably the 1870s, but it's a very nice, or it captures very nicely what I would call a proto factory. It's not a full factory, it is effectively a domestic setting, but the production, the scale of production, is beyond that pure domestic industry. We've got at least 4 looms there working away. Yes, we do have a traditional spinner. The spinster there is just a very traditional spinning wheel. It's not a spinning jenny, but you could certainly imagine a row of spinning jennies in that same environment. And this is the step towards the factory production of cotton. That great leap, that final step to the full factory setup, was achieved by this portly guy, Richard Arkwright. He probably doesn't need any introduction. He is effectively the most famous name associated with the textile industry, and has been accredited with the title Father of the Factory System. Now, his claim to fame came initially from patenting a very clever spinning machine that was known as the spinning frame initially, and more or less as soon as he devised it, he coupled it up to be powered by a water wheel, and it was known thereafter as the water frame. And I was patenting that in 1769. There is quite an academic argument over whether he actually invented it or whether he actually stole the key mechanism, which was the drafting rollers in it, from another guy called Thomas Hayes. And there is a lot of evidence to suggest that it was actually pirated from Thomas Hayes. And you can say this about several of the inventions that Arkwright came out with. And I don't want to do the man down, but he might not have been the genius that he is sometimes accredited with in terms of his inventions, but there can be no question that he was the entrepreneur par excellence for this period. He brought stuff together, and in that he excelled. Having painted his water frame in 1769, he had a vision, and that vision was to put a number of these machines in a purpose-built mill, just like they were doing in silk mills. And he achieved that at Cromford in 1771, where he built Cromford Mill, and we have a picture of it on the top right. This was essentially the world's first water-powered cotton mill, and it was hugely successful. A couple of years later, Arkwright patented a carding machine. Now, the carding machine was a key device, and it was used for the preparation of the cotton. It prepared the raw cotton ready for spinning, and up to that time that had been a device that had a process that had to be carried out by hand. Arkwright managed to mechanise it, and in doing so, he introduced the full factory system, whereby a raw bale of cotton, the raw material, could effectively be delivered to the indoor at the factory, and it could go through the entire production process inside and come out the other end as finished yarn, ready for weaving. That's where early factories hadn't really achieved. They were only doing part of that process. Arkwright had the full production process in one building, and that's really why he's accredited this title, Father of the Factory System. It was hugely successful, and it allowed him to set about building more mills at Cromford. He built more mills around other parts of Derbyshire. He attracted investment, and this was the thing he was brilliant at, and that was attracting financial backers and supporters. And that's one of the ways he actually did it. He persuaded people to back him to build a mill near them. And he had many people who were very keen to support him, and many people made an awful lot of money, not least Arkwright. Most of his early mills, all of his early mills, were in Derbyshire. There's a few here, got Linton Mill from 1777, Cressbrook Mill, 1785. Those are just a few. There was several more. I put these up because I think you can see just from those photographs of those two mills, it's a very characteristic style to an Arkwright type mill. There's a certain look about them. What isn't immediately obvious there, perhaps, is that yes, they're multi-storey, generally 4 or 5 floors. That was quite standard for Arkwright. They have a clock, and here we bring in time. Time was of the essence. You turn up there at 6 o'clock in the morning. You work there till the clock says you can go home. There was the daylight, the sun, suddenly wasn't as important as it used to be. And to my mind, that was probably one of the greatest changes of industrialisation. Yes, it was a great change seeing buildings like this suddenly appear on the landscape, but there was the implications of it were even greater in many respects. Another characteristic feature of Arkwright mills that you can't really gauge from these photographs is that they were actually quite narrow buildings, and that was down to the structural technology of the day. Yes, builders at Congleton and elsewhere where they were building silk mills had achieved this challenge of building, of creating a massive building to house these machineries, but it was still difficult to get the width because we didn't have the structural technology to have the big beams that would span more than a long timber, effectively. The other key thing about Arkwright's mills, and all the mills to that date, that is important, I think, to note, is that they were water-powered, which is fine, that was the only option open to them. But that meant they were tied, in terms of their location, to a river. And not any river. A lot of rivers are wholly inappropriate to drive water wheels. Certainly down the lower reaches of rivers, where they become mature watercourses, you cannot get the fall to run a water wheel. So in Lancaster City, for instance, we don't find any water-powered mill, or many water-powered mills. In Manchester, which became this great mecca of the cotton industry, it was very slow to start because the River Irwell and the River Medlock, which flow through Manchester, aren't that suitable to run water wheels, and therefore it was very, very, very limited.